I've been asked to speak about the subject, Cuba, challenges and change as it relates to security. And the first disclaimer is that I'll be looking at security in its traditional sense, not the new emerging definition, which basically broadly is putting security as a, how should I say now, a quality of life issue by itself. I'm looking at the traditional definition of security, to be careful about any prognostication on Cuba, it being so dynamic, and sometimes we're very wrong, especially those who may have some issues with Cuba. And thirdly, in his absence, I'm grateful for the Prime Minister for somewhat setting the stage on the background in that most excellent and eloquent presentation on the subject. Security is not a standalone. Security, I would suggest to you, is built on, or your security posture, I would suggest, on 4 pillars or 4 dynamics. And I would look at these from the point of view of Cuba and how these will tend to define Cuba's posture towards the rest of us, her neighbors. And I would suggest that the first one is the international or regional environment that is prevailing. I would go on further to suggest that the internal domestic environment within Cuba would be a second pillar that would help to shape Cuba's position. Those two put together would shape the third dynamic, which is Cuba's foreign or regional policy towards the rest of us, her neighbors. And it is from that foreign and domestic policy that we would have a defense and security policy emerging from Cuba and how Cuba relates to the rest of us. So those 4 dynamics, I would suggest, would combine together to define the end of that continuum, which would show Cuba's neighborly posture as it relates to security. I would like to have a quick look at each of those in turn without being too exhaustive. Firstly, the environment, the regional. Here I need my glasses to read my scribbling. I think we all accept that currently Cuba, in a sense, is the odd man out within the hemisphere. But we have begun to see some incremental changes. We have to be mindful of the dominant player within the hemisphere, the United States. We are within a hemisphere that is at peace as it relates to states actors, one state against the other. But we are mindful as well that there are still some lingering territorial disputes within the region, within the hemisphere. The threat within the region, of course, comes from non-state actors. And these are mostly transnational in nature. And just to name a few, transnational criminal activities, drug trafficking, terrorism, narco-terrorism, criminal gangs, etc., etc. Also would be the regional and hemispheric economic considerations which will impact on what happens. Secondly, the internal domestic environment. Again, we see a constant here that the United States potentially would be a major lever in what emerges out of Cuba. First of all, we have to consider what kind of leadership will emerge out of Cuba. What will be the role of the Cuban military? It has not been mentioned in any presentation today, but I would suggest that the Cuban military will have a very significant role in Cuba moving ahead, domestically and otherwise. The internal economy, of course, and then, very importantly, what transitional arrangements, and particularly as the transitional arrangements will relate to the rate of change. We know some of the externalities that will be impatient. We don't know the pace at which Cuba will want to move in their own interest. Those two dynamics, as I suggested, would influence the domestic, foreign, and regional policy shaped by the foregoing, which in a sense would come to the fourth one, which would be the defense or security policy that would be informed by all the foregoing. The question is, to what extent will Cuba feel secure from threat of invasion, real or imagined? United States, non-states actors, what confidence building, confidence enhancing measures will be developed over that period? I would suggest that there's a direct correlation between Cuba's comfort level with its own sense of security and the extent to which Cuba cooperates or coordinates in this whole aspect of the security arena regionally, but particularly the United States. It is recognized globally the transnational nature of it is recognized globally the transnational nature of most of the non-state actors and the crimes that confront us. With the opening of Cuba, of course, some of the ills, and I'm not quite sure to what extent criminality in Cuba as it exists now, to what extent it does. Is it being suppressed? We know the nature of the press there. I am not sure, but I would not suggest that Cuba is crime-free. But with an opening up will come some of the ills that we are facing everywhere else. And they will face the same problem we faced because of geographic location, which they are facing now, in fact. So Cuba, like the rest of us, because no one state can confront the security challenge alone, will have to increase its levels of cooperation and coordination in the security arena. Cuba will therefore have to engage regional partners and the partners will have to engage with Cuba. One of the quickest maritime delimitation negotiation we had, Jamaica, was with Cuba. In fact, it literally took 1 hour. The preamble in the normal diplomatese and so on was longer than, in fact, the technical side of it. And I could contrast that with another neighbor where we had over 10 sessions of brutal bloodletting over several years to hammer out an agreement. With Cuba, it was 1 hour, and we spent the rest of the time, 4 days, which were put aside for it, having a good time. Cuba has the potential to bring useful capacity to regional security arrangements. One of the things with Cuba is, in fact, as a consequence of the embargo, Cuba has been innovative, just like we have had in South Africa and in Israel. One of the results of embargoes is that it fuels innovation and creativity.